Right, we're going to be starting here any minute. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. We are going to be calling to order the City of Salem Budget Committee for January 11th, 2023. Would the recorder please call the roll?
Member Milton? Absent. Member Cohen?
Present.
Member Tigan?
Present.
Hi, folks. I
Member
don't
Vera
know.
Brandel?
I can't hear any sound in council
Absent.
chambers.
Member Nishioka?
Present.
Member Phillips?
Here.
Member Gwen?
Here.
Member Gonzalez? Absent. Member Julie Hoy?
Here.
Member Vanessa Nordyke?
Here.
Member Varney?
Here.
Member Chris Hoy?
Here.
Member Dixon?
Here.
Member DeCarmo? Absent. Member Chirac?
Here.
Vice Chair Brown?
Present.
And Chair Stapleton.
I'm here.
Thank you.
And it looks like, did we get Vera Brandel?
I called her, but maybe I didn't see her.
She's now online.
Oh, perfect. I will count you as present. Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank
there
you.
was no sound at the beginning for us.
No worries. Thank you so much. All right. It looks like we are going to stand and pledge allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. And before we get started, I wanted to welcome everybody online and here in person. And of course, this whole hybrid thing is new to us, so please bear with us as we try to sort it all out. But I also wanted to hand it over to City Manager Staley for a welcome.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Chair. I appreciate the introduction. My name is Keith Staley. I am the City Manager. Tomorrow, I will start my 5th month with the City of Salem. Today's the last day, I guess, of my 4th month. So. But who's counting? City Council has established 4 priorities. They are responding to our homeless crisis, engaging our community, planning for our future, and building a sustainable platform for infrastructure and services. And as we've talked about those 4 priorities at a staff level, we keep coming back to this has to be our priority this year. Building the sustainable budget for the city moving forward has to be our priority. So this, from at least from a staff perspective, and certainly we hope from a budget committee perspective as well, that this will be our priority for the coming 6 months until our budget is adopted. Over the past 10 years, council and staff have done a remarkable job in stitching things together, making do and finding workarounds. I think we're beyond that point presently. We can't work smarter or do more with less any longer. That well has gone dry. We literally have wrung this system and organization dry. So passing the $300 million public infrastructure bond is wonderful. And it sets the stage for significant investment in our roads, our sidewalks, our parks, our fire equipment, our fire stations, library sites, and affordable housing. And these are all wonderful and necessary investments. It also creates expectations about services like staffing another fire station, building and operating an additional library, maintaining new parks, facilities, and roadways. And those are obligations that we can't presently meet with our current budgetary structure. So we've got work to do. Salem's population has increased 23,840 people since 2010. If those 23,840 people were a municipality in the state of Oregon, they would be Oregon's 28th largest community. So not an insignificant increase by any stretch. Interestingly, our calls for service, and our police chief and fire chief will attest to this, have increased far faster than our population has increased. Population has been dramatic, but our calls for service have at least doubled the rate of population increase. And we'll obviously have more details to share about that as we go forward. So to me, our choices are going to be relatively simple here going forward, but that does not mean easy. There's a difference. We can increase our revenues or we can decrease our expenses, but we have to do one or the other. So that will be the challenge in front of you over the next few months. There are revenue options, and Josh and I will be presenting those as we move forward here and working with you throughout this process to have those conversations. None of these discussions are easy, and it will involve hard conversations with the committee and the community going forward, but we're ready to get started, and tonight's tonight, and we're here to support you in that process. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Thank you. I also wanted to thank staff in the room for being here tonight. We really appreciate you being here, and I have come to rely on you so much for these conversations. So thank you for your expertise. Do we have any public comment tonight?
No, ma'am. No one signed up.
Thank you so much. All right. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from our May 11th, 2022 meeting?
I move to approve the minutes of the May 11th, 2022 meeting.
I'll second.
Great. Moved by Mayor Hoy and seconded by our lovely representative from Ward 1, Member Tigan. Thank you. And we're going to go ahead and do a roll call vote because we have a split between in-person and online, so we figured it would be just real straightforward to do it that way. So please call the roll.
Member Milton, absent. Member Cohen,
Aye.
Member Tigan,
Aye.
Member Vieira Brandel,
Aye.
Member Nishioka,
Aye.
Member Phillips,
Aye.
Member Gwen,
Aye.
Member Gonzalez is absent. Member Julie Hoy,
Aye.
Member Nordike,
Aye.
Member Varney,
Aye.
Member Chris Hoy,
Aye.
Member Dixon,
Aye.
Member DeCarmo is absent. Member Chirac,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown,
Aye.
and Chair Stapleton.
Aye. Motion passes. Thank you. Next up is our election of officers. Do we have any nominations for the election of chairperson?
I move to nominate Chair Stapleton as chair.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Is there any other nominations? Okay. Seeing none, we will go ahead and do a roll call vote again.
Member Cohen,
Aye.
Member Tigan,
Aye.
Member Vieira Brandel,
Aye.
Member Nishioka,
Aye.
Member Phillips,
Aye.
Member Gwen,
Aye.
Member Julie Hoy,
Aye.
Member Nordike,
Aye.
Member Varney,
Aye.
Member Chris Hoy,
Aye.
Member Dixon,
Aye.
Member Chirac,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown,
Aye.
Chair Stapleton.
Aye. Motion passes. Thank you so much, everybody. Just really quick before we move on, I wanted to ask Josh, sorry, I was trying to catch your eye there. Historically, we have gone kind of back and forth between chairs being from our citizen side of things and the council side of things. When this opportunity came up, I wanted to double check with him if this was okay. And of course, could you just speak to that a little bit?
Sure, it's been the common practice for the Budget Committee to alternate between resident and citizen members, but there's nothing in the procedures or state law to prevent you from doing something different.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to put that out there. I think it's a really great practice to go back and forth. I think that's great. But also when it is needed to be the same, we can break with tradition and do something new. So moving forward, do we have any nominations for vice chairperson? All right, Member Nordyke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to nominate Dr. Irvin M. Brown for the position of Vice Chair, Budget Committee.
Fantastic.
Second.
Thank you. Second by Tigan. Is there any other nominations? All right, seeing none, can we call the roll?
Member Cohen,
Aye.
Member Tigan,
Aye.
Member Vieira Brandel,
Aye.
Member Nishioka,
Aye.
Member Phillips,
Aye.
Member Gwen,
Aye.
Member Julie Hoy,
Aye.
Member Nordyke,
Aye.
Member Varney,
Aye.
Member Chris Hoy,
Aye.
Member Dixon,
Aye.
Member Chirac,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown,
Aye.
and Chair Stapleton.
Aye. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. You really were a support for me last year, and I'm really looking forward to working with you again. All right, so next up we have secretary, and staff have identified that the officer position of secretary does not have any responsibilities and recommended that the budget committee procedures be modified to remove this position. So I am hoping that we may have a motion to direct staff to do such removal.
I move we direct staff to eliminate the secretary position in our bylaws.
Second.
Thank you. It's so hard to remember all of the different names that I call you by. So thank you, Member Hoy, for the motion, and the second by Member Phillips. Can we go ahead and call the roll on that?
Member Cohen,
Aye.
Member Tigan,
Aye.
Member Vieira Brandel,
Aye.
Member Nishioka,
Aye.
Member Phillips,
Aye.
Member Gwen,
Aye.
Member Julie Hoy,
Aye.
Member Nordyke,
Aye.
Member Varney,
Aye.
Member Chris Hoy,
Aye.
Member Dixon,
Aye.
Member Chirac,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown,
Aye.
and Chair Stapleton.
Aye, motion passes. That feels good, to kind of clean that up, huh? All righty, so the motion passes. We will be moving on to our information reports. So I would like to ask our CFO, Josh Eggleston, to review the information under this agenda item, and then also to present our 5-year forecast under special orders of business.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just share the screen. Sorry, technical difficulties. Sorry about that. Good evening. I'm Josh Eggleston, the city's Chief Financial Officer. The information items for this evening's meeting include 4 quarterly financial summaries. I'll not be reviewing those this evening, but they're provided for your information as part of the city's discipline and monitoring, analysis, and reporting. There's also a staff report that references the general fund deferred staffing needs and internal services benchmarking that I will reference briefly during my presentation and the next presentation by Moss Adams. And then after the presentation, I'll be doing a brief introduction of the city's new performance management portal and a new budget simulation. You also should have copies of the 2 presentations on your desks. If you don't have them, please let us know. Sometimes the screen can be difficult to see. The main focus of our time this evening is the city's 5-year financial forecasts. I would like to recognize and thank department analysts, directors, and staff that dedicated the hours necessary to assist the budget office in producing this important financial planning document. The city forecast for 14 funds of 25 total funds, but tonight the presentation will highlight 3 of those funds: transportation services, the utility, and general funds. As with any budgeting process, even in our personal lives, you add up all your expenses and your income or revenue in this case, and you forecast what the next year or the next 5 years look like. Forecasting is a financial best practice and serves as a tool for city staff, city council, and the budget committee as we move into development of the next budget, fiscal year 2024. The forecast does not predict the future. In fact, I'll guarantee it won't be 100% accurate, but it serves to display a likely outcome and help identify and mitigate issues before they become critical. The budget office and city departments forecast using the latest information and assumptions. Salem is a full-service city with that service being provided by people. As the largest operating expense, we calculate personnel costs at the individual position level with estimates for future merit increases, cost of living adjustments, PERS or public employee retirement system, and health benefits. Many of these costs are generally outside of the city's direct control and are either mandated or negotiated. And those cost increases apply across all city funds. On the revenue side, we model revenues using historical trends and other known information. For example, our property tax estimates are calculated using a model that looks at individual properties in Salem and any new developments that were added over the previous year. Before I jump into transportation, are there any questions on the methodology or purpose? Seeing none. The first fund for discussion this evening is the Transportation Services Fund, which supports the operation and maintenance of the city's streets, traffic signals, and sidewalks. The Transportation Services Fund provides the financial structure for the department to respond to city council goals that address long-term support of community needs for safety, livability, environmental health, and economic development. Additional detail for this forecast can be found beginning on page 19 of the forecast document. So that's the one that's actually spiral bound that you should have at your desk. So we're going to be talking about a lot of numbers today, so please feel free to ask questions as we go through if something doesn't make sense. On this slide, the gold bars represent revenues and the gray bars represent net expenditures. Net expenditures are the total expenditures less anticipated savings. So think of it, you have a budget and then there's some organic savings that you expect. So we recognize that organic savings. And also the green line, using the right axes, represents the fund balance or checking account. That's the actual cash on hand. The Transportation Services Fund has substantially stabilized from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's projecting a declining fund balance over the forecast period. The one-time federal relief from the American Rescue Plan Act funds for revenue replacement, as well as FEMA and insurance proceeds from the 2021 ice storm, have contributed to a healthier beginning fund balance in the forecast period. The State Highway Fund revenue, often referred to as gas tax, the primary revenue source for this fund is anticipated to grow slightly through the forecast period, but fuel usage and vehicle choices impact the revenue of this fund. Assuming that the revenue grows slightly through the forecast period and uses some of that fund balance, the fund will be able to sustain the current staffing levels. However, action will be needed to correct the projected decline in fund balance. One recommendation you might remember from the Sustainable Services Revenue Task Force in 2018, and also a strategy included in the Climate Action Plan, is a local gas tax that could bolster fund balance, increase maintenance, and other projects. This display of potential variability, which I'll show you for each of the 3 funds presented today, demonstrate what we believe to be the probable result, which is displayed in the forecast document. It's the middle bars, this blue line. And then we take that probable forecast, augmented by 1% of additional revenue and 1% of additional expenditure savings, a total of a 2% positive change. The outcome represented by the green bars is a more optimistic scenario with a very small change. On the other end of the scenario is the red bar depiction, 1% less revenue, 1% greater expense or lowered savings. As you can see, the red bars go negative in the 4th year of the forecast instead of the 5th year. Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Josh. Before we got too far past the this particular graph. I wanted to ask you, have you done any updated forecasting on what a fuel tax would, what kind of revenue it would generate? Like whatever, for every penny that we were to implement, what would that result given today's usage and that's sort of today's world?
Excellent question. We haven't updated that information. I'm assuming it'll be a little bit more than it was when we looked at it 4 years ago, but we can get that information for you. We were looking at a 5 or 6 cents per gallon tax back when we were in the task force.
Which would have provided how much revenue annually?
We'll get that number for you. Or is it in the? Great. Go ahead. Yeah, you're welcome to.
Hey, Mr. Mayor. On page 21 of the spiral book, forecast results, second large paragraph states, if enacted at a rate of 6 cents per gallon, a local option gas tax would provide $4.8 million in annual resources.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I did not see that.
Thanks, Drew. Which for the transportation fund is a significant amount of money.
Excuse me, may I ask a question to that? Is that assuming that the gasoline cars will be remaining about the same? Or with more electric vehicles being present, would there be any change in that?
It's an excellent question. We've been monitoring it. The ODOT forecast still is showing an increase year over year, but it's less of an increase. So we are seeing declining returns over time. I'm assuming at some point the state and likely local municipalities are going to look for a different mechanism to charge for road usage of vehicle miles traveled. There are some other options, but in the short term, I think a gas tax is a very viable option.
Any other questions before we move forward?
Josh, does the city have a balanced fund policy the way it does for the general fund, working capital for transportation?
No, I don't believe we do. We don't have a fund balance policy.
Okay.
Any other questions on transportation? That's the last slide. Okay. So next is the utility fund that supports the ongoing operations and maintenance of the utility, including treatment, storage, and delivery of drinking water to residents, businesses, and industries, collection, conveyance, and treatment of wastewater before it's returned to the Willamette River, and collection and conveyance of stormwater runoff from streets, buildings, and other hard surfaces throughout the system to reduce risks of flooding and protect the environment. In addition, the fund supports the payment of utility revenue bonds for system infrastructure improvements, as well as annual transfers to the Capital Improvements Fund for pay-as-you-go capital projects. Additional detail for this forecast can be found beginning on page 27 of the forecast document. The city's utility is financially stable, largely due to consistent small rate increases and the measured, constant, and deliberate approach to operation, maintenance, and expansion of the utility systems. The forecast for the utility continues investment in capital infrastructure of $21.4 million to $26.5 million in the first 3 years of the forecast, and then increases to over $31 million as debt obligations are reduced. Continued improvements must be made to the utility at a sustainable pace, balancing rate impacts with the rehabilitation, expansion, resiliency, and modernization needs of the system. As you might remember, almost every year, some form of emergency impacts revenue or expenditures, and maintaining proper reserve levels allows a response without an urgent rate increase. Examples include the 2008 water advisory, 2019 pandemic, 2020 wildfires, 2021 ice storm, and heat wave.
Josh, I have a quick question for you here.
Go ahead.
We just all got notices of an increase in our rates. How are people to see that within this graph?
So in that graph, that's the reason it looks so good, right? You don't see a declining fund balance. So that water wastewater task force that meets every 2 years, they maintain this financial structure. They maintain that structural balance where you're collecting more revenues than your expenditures. For the utility, there's also adjusting the capital infrastructure piece. It's a very capital intensive utility. There's a lot of pipes, a lot of infrastructure. So it's really important to maintain that fund balance. It's also important for revenue bonds. Meets the 120 days of operating expenses that is in council policy. Maintaining this level of balance is important, as we mentioned, for an infrastructure-heavy enterprise such as the utility. In this forecast variability display, you can see the different picture that happens with the utility as opposed to transportation, or what we'll look at next with the general fund. The 1% of better revenue and better savings makes an already positive result even better. Both the blue and green bars provide sufficient fund balance or reserves to cover the 120 days of operating costs and 1 year of debt service. The negative variables, 1% less and 1% more expense, create a result that is outside of the fund balance policy for years 3 and 4 of the forecast period. So that demonstrates even with that variability, you're still sliding in that edge. So 2% different makes it less than that forecast for that fund balance policy for 2 of the years. Any questions on the utility?
Josh, before you head into the general fund, I guess my question is, the relative health of the utility is not new. Is the lack of health, I don't know what to call the transportation services fund, the idea that it would come into such stark imbalance, it is now, but would be in 5 years completely out of balance. Is that new? I don't remember seeing that last year. I don't know if other committee members remember seeing it, or were we just skirting close to it now, and now it's like, yeah, by 2028.
So one of the major differences between the utility and transportation, on the utility side, we can control the revenue, right? We adjust rates as needed. And this year we went with, the council adopted a 5% rate increase as opposed to a 3% rate slope that has been history. In the transportation fund, that solving happens with the maintenance and operations. So you either do more or less to maintain that fund balance. So this depiction, maintaining the current service level, could look different if we reduce that service level to make it look better. But the picture isn't materially different than it has been in the past. There's still been that unmet need. It's just we've just made adjustments as we go forward to make it work. And Public Works could speak to it more directly if you'd like.
Does anyone online have any questions? Yes, Vanessa, or sorry, Member Nordyke.
No worries. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Josh, as always, for your presentation. And I'd also like to take a brief moment to welcome all the new committee members. Budget Committee is one of the most important committees in city government. So thank you for your service in advance. Now to my question. Josh, as we know, our city is growing rapidly, and the council has voted to approve several new projects that are going to add hundreds of new units. And I would assume that with hundreds more units coming online, that means more utility accounts. So my question goes to methodology. How are we accounting for the rapid increase in apartment complexes and other types of new utility accounts that may be coming online in the coming years? And how is that demonstrated in the forecast in front of us?
A really great question. I'm going to defer to Public Works, who can speak more to the methodology for rate setting.
Good evening. My name is Alicia Blaylock. I'm the division manager for the Administration Division in Public Works. We have a fairly complex modeling structure, and we make assumptions about each of the different types of customer accounts, some based on history or some based on knowledge. Sometimes we know things from our development services section that tell us how many things are coming online. But when we're looking that far out into the future, 5 years or more, we just make some general assumptions about account growth.
And what kind of assumptions are we making about growth? Are we making very modest assumptions? Because I've heard from other city staff in our planning department, folks like Eunice Kim and her team, that we estimate an additional 60,000 people moving to Salem by the year 2035. And I recognize that not all 60,000 people will be utility customers, but I'm just wondering to what extent we are making modest assumptions about the expected growth that we are seeing in the city.
I think it's fair to say that we do tend to be fairly conservative in our assumptions because we don't want to be wrong on the other side of it, right? We don't want to come up short and really find ourselves in a deficit situation. So part of our focus in this last go round was really properly identifying the recovery from the COVID pandemic. Because the last time we did rate setting, we were heading into the pandemic, or right at the beginning of it, and we were very, very conservative. And we found that we had to adjust some of those, and so the picture looked a little bit better this time than we were predicting 2 years ago. So we're constantly reevaluating, but that's something we can take a look at, some of the planning projections, and see how they align.
Thank you, Member Nordike. That was great. Any other questions? Are we moving on to our next fund? Is this?
Did I see Member Dixon with a question?
So they took my computer because I can't see you folks online. So if you do have a question, please speak up or kind of wave your hand around so I can see you. But Member Dixon, did you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had one question about transportation services. Are the cost projections for the 2022 bond projects factored in to this budget, or would they appear in a different fund entirely? And either way, how are the cost projections for those projects holding up against the price inflation in construction costs?
Really good question. So it is a separate fund, so that's contained in the Capital Improvements Fund. What we did with the bond projects is we inflated them to the midpoint of 10 years. Since it's a 10-year bond, all the projects were inflated to that midpoint, so some will come in a little bit lower, hopefully, and some will come in a little higher. But we are monitoring it. I don't know if, Brian, do you want to speak to it more directly?
Sure. Brian Martin, Acting Public Works Director. We have other projects going on that are very similar to the bond, so every couple of weeks we're bidding projects. We're kind of watching where those prices are. They seem to have leveled out a little bit here recently in the last couple of months. I'm not sure what that means going forward, but when we estimated the projects, we did it exactly as Josh had mentioned, to the midpoint of construction. So we'll see. It's hard to tell. We do the best we can as we estimate these projects, but things have leveled off anyway, so that's somewhat good news.
Thank you.
All right, and Member Shrock.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first I need to ask, is Josh going to speak more about the general fund, or he briefly said a few things earlier on? Are we ready to move on to the next item? Because I have a question about the general fund, but if Josh is going to speak more about that, I'll wait until he's done.
Yes, I believe that we're going to be heading that direction right now.
Okay, I'll hold on. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
And that is correct. The rest of the presentation is focused on the general fund. The city's general fund supports operations in the areas of public safety, planning, code enforcement, public library, municipal court, parks and recreation, urban development, and support services that provide a citywide benefit. This chart displays the general fund supported departments and the corresponding expenditure budget for year one, or fiscal year 2024 of the 5-year forecast period. Additional detail for this forecast can be found beginning on page 8 of the forecast document. The forecast maintains the same staffing without any new programs being added. To be clear, the continuation of current unsheltered programs being funded using state or federal funds are not included in this forecast. Also, the recent budget amendment for commercial air service is not included in the forecast document, but I do have a later slide that shows the impact. In the general fund, the revenue budget totals $160.6 million compared to the total budget expenditures of $176.9 million. Property taxes make up over half of the general fund revenues at $84.01 million, forecasted for fiscal year 2024. For comparison, the same year, the combined police and fire departments budget equal $106.5. I'll spend a little bit of time on this table, and feel free to ask questions. There's a lot of numbers here. At the top is the beginning fund balance, equivalent to a checking account or cash on hand. The balance is important for several reasons. The first is just a basic cash flow need. The general fund's largest revenue source is property taxes that are received starting in November. The city needs to be able to continue to pay bills and make payroll for July, August, September, and October. In fiscal years 2020, 2021, and 2022, the general fund cash balance went negative in October prior to those receipts. That's the first reason. The second reason is being able to respond to unknown or large fluctuations in expenditures or revenues. You might hear about a rainy day fund. We don't have that, so fund balance serves that purpose. So when things like the ice storm happens, natural disasters, we're able to do amendments and access that unappropriated fund balance, that cash on hand. The third, I mentioned before for the utility, is for our bond credit rating. Cash on hand is a large factor when a rating agency is evaluating the fiscal health of an entity. We currently maintain a AA2 from Moody's, and our bonds are very competitive largely due to this rating. It saves taxpayers millions of dollars by reducing our cost to borrow. Just real quick before we leave the beginning fund balance, any questions here? You might know it as a different term, working capital. It's all the same thing. It's basically cash you have for operations.
I have a question. CFO, so remember last year we had this conversation about the general fund, and you mentioned that we didn't have a rainy day fund, and we still don't, right?
Correct. We have working capital fund balance, and it floats us for that cash flow need, but there's no separate reserve specifically for something like that.
Right, and so if something happens like the ice storm or the heat wave, you pull that money from, where are you pulling it from?
So good question. So I'm going to get a little.
I'm just curious, right? I mean, obviously we have some issues, right? And when the ice comes and the heat comes and we got to pay for something, like, was it 2 years ago when all the trees came down and they were just stayed in the city for like a whole year and we didn't have the money? So where are we pulling the money from?
So I'm going to get a little technical here, so sorry for the jargon, but it's unappropriated ending fund balance. So you have the general fund budget, and then you have that cash on hand that's not budgeted. So that cash on hand, in the event of a natural disaster, the city council can adopt a supplemental budget to access that unappropriated ending fund balance. In the case of an ice storm or something like that, usually we keep very good track of our costs and we get reimbursed by FEMA. Which is great. We actually haven't seen that ice storm reimbursement yet, but we hope to get it this year. We're on track to, at least, but it takes a while. You know, it's a couple-year process to get that reimbursement. But that's the process. You have unappropriated fund balance. You can't access it usually, but in a natural disaster you can.
I had a follow-up to that, if you don't mind. One, I want to make sure that Public Works knows that we're very thankful for the hard work of our street tree crews and getting that cleaned up as fast as possible. But it was a ton of work. Could you give me an example of what that cost us in order so that we can kind of understand? I mean, we all remember the ice storm and the magnitude of that emergency, but what did that come to as far as what kind of cash on hand do we need in order to handle some kind of emergency like that?
So I don't have those numbers, but it looks like Alicia Blaylock might.
I'm going to give you general numbers, and if we need more specifics, we can get back to you. But overall, the ice storm cost us about $6 million. We had about $2.5 million that we received from insurance. We had very good insurance. And we put some of that in a reserve to replant the trees. And then the rest of it, about $4 million, is coming from FEMA. And we've submitted all the paperwork for the reimbursement, except for one little piece, the administration piece at the end. So there's $175,000 out there that we still need to claim, but we've claimed the rest of it.
Great, thank you.
And follow up from that.
Yes, please.
So I remember during the ice storm, and it was a big mess, and I felt bad for the people that had cleaned it up, because I was under the impression that we did not have enough personnel. Lots of trees, but not enough people to do the work. So have we tapped into the fund till we can bring on more people to help?
We actually used contractors.
Oh, we did?
To a large part, yeah.
Oh, is that the plan going forth? If there's another big ice storm, do we just get contractors to come in, or are we gonna? I'm creating a big mess, aren't I?
Mark Bechtel, Public Works Operations Manager. If you look at how Public Works Operations is structured, we maintain our crews, our in-house personnel, at a level to respond to basically your day-to-day routine maintenance and incidents that occur in our infrastructure. When we have something larger than that, we go to a pool of ready contractors that have already pre-bid their services. They're called contractors of record, and they are our first line of reinforcement in any kind of either a project or a disaster or a storm, whenever we need that additional manpower, staffing, and resources. Same thing with our equipment. We don't own every piece of equipment we could ever need. That's what contractors are for, and it's a partnership that we have with contractors to get the job done.
Thank you. And City Manager?
Thank you, Chair. Josh, so it sounds like we've got an outstanding bill with our friends from FEMA. We're anticipating reimbursement somewhere, it sounds like around $4 million.
So across all funds, I think the total was about $4 million, yes.
And how will those funds be distributed?
So if you were to dive into the spreadsheets behind these forecasts, it's built in. So we anticipate that reimbursement. So it's already built into the revenue lines. It's dispersed. Where the work was done is where the funds go back to.
Great. And it looks like we have a question from Member Nordyke, and then we'll go to Member Nishioka.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a different question, although I very much appreciate the discussion of the ice storm. I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the assumptions that may be made about general fund expenditures, and has to do with vacancies. My understanding is that we have a lot of vacancies right now in the police department, over between 20 and 30, if memory serves. In forecast, and we all know that our police department takes up a sizable chunk of our general fund budget. So I guess my question is, in making the assumptions about future expenditures specific to the police department, does it assume that we will be fully staffed and that those vacancies will all be filled? Thank you.
And I actually addressed that in my comments in just a second, so I can.
Okay, if you want, yeah, if I am jumping the gun, I'm happy to wait until a more appropriate time.
Great, thank you. Member Nishioka.
Yes, this question is to Public Works. I'm curious if the contractors that you have on your list, do we need to pay them a retainer? Or they're just ready and available, and you just verify that that's true on a regular basis?
Sorry about that. Brian Martin again. Typically, there's not a retainer, so they bid a contract. They do have to pay for bonds and insurance and submit that stuff when they submit their contract, but then it's an on-call situation.
Director, I had another question for you on this. It is my understanding that, like many of the different areas in the city, our street tree crew could use more permanent folks there helping just maintain all of the trees that we have across the city. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, and I'll make sure to address Member Nordyke's question as well. So before we get there, the second row is the estimated general fund revenues or income that the city receives. The third row is the total expenditures or the estimated budget appropriation that is reduced by the next two lines, which are unspent contingency. The city budgets $3 million in the general fund to ensure we have funds available in case they are needed, but we only anticipate our forecast to spend $500,000. Unlike a natural disaster, for most things that are unanticipated, you're not able to access that unappropriated fund balance. So that's why you have a budgeted contingency, and staff can come to city council, access that for specific instances, and we make that transfer. So it's we anticipate $500,000 of that being used on an annual basis, and that other $2.5 million rolls back into fund balance for the next year. The next row speaks to Member Nordike's question. It's for organic savings across the general fund for vacancies or employee turnover. We budget fully for each position, and we would like them all to be filled, but that isn't always the case. There's natural attrition that creates savings throughout the year. On the far left, the fiscal year 2023 year-end estimate. So that's the current budget. We have a lot better information about this year than we do next year because we're in this year. We know that the police department has 22 vacancies right now. So that savings is built into that police department estimate for the expenditures. So when you look at this net expenditure line, it includes that expectations of savings. Going forward, we estimate 2.5%. That does anticipate some of those vacancies being filled. So if there's additional vacancies in the police department specifically, that number could be a little higher, but it's different by each department. For example, the fire department, if they have vacancies, they cover it with overtime, and it actually makes it more expensive. So there's no vacancy savings generally in the fire department. So it just varies depending on which department you're in. Does that address your question, Member Nordike?
It does, and it prompts a follow-up, as your thorough analysis often does, Josh. Thank you. First of all, I think it's a really valid point that overtime can really eat into the so-called savings from vacancies, and having vacancies in public safety is not a good thing because it raises concerns about our ability to keep the public safe. For the 22 police vacancies, I'm wondering, are these mostly new positions, i.e. at the bottom of the pay scale that we are looking to fill, or are a number of them more quote unquote expensive positions like sergeant, captain, lieutenant, et cetera? I'm just curious in terms of the kinds of positions that we're looking to fill. Are these for brand new persons straight out of the academy and DPSST certification? Or are we looking at the fact that perhaps some of our more senior police department employees may be retiring and we have the PERS expense in addition to trying to fill another higher up position?
I see the chief coming down, but just really quick. So when we budget for vacant positions, we budget them at the lowest level, step one. And then for us, we budget full family benefits. So a lot of times if you bring a lateral on, it lands at a higher step, but they might not have full family benefits. So it's a budget appropriation. It's not perfect, but there is some evening out that happens. Chief?
Thank you, Josh. Trevor Womack, Chief of Police. I'll just add that we do have vacancies at all levels, all ranks, including at the deputy chief level, the highest level, besides myself. But folks promote up into those ranks. And so when we have a sworn vacancy, it truly is a new lower cost officer that fills that gap. So we promote up the ranks, if that makes sense. So existing staff are the ones that promote up. So entry level staff are the ones that come in at the lowest rate.
Member Cohen.
Thank you, Chair. Josh, I saw in the City of Salem financial summary of the year end that the fund balance was at 10.8 million in savings, departmental savings. And part of that was the COVID funding, which is 5.94 mil, which then left about 4.8 mil due to departmental belt tightening. My question, maybe it's to you, maybe it's to the city manager, is kind of heard both things in that we need more resources, but then you're not fully expending your budget. And typically I would promote that, right? I don't want you to fully expend your budget. But is that a practice that you would foresee to continue, that you would have this departmental belt tightening and you'll have this built-in savings, or do you expect to fully expend all of your departmental costs?
I'll answer real quick, then I'll hand it over. We don't mandate or recommend we maintain vacancies for savings. We don't require that from the budget office or from the city manager's office. So if there's vacancies, it's really waiting for someone to get in that position. So there's not any belt tightening happening position-wise. We want to get those positions filled. In some cases, that's extremely difficult, especially for our public safety departments.
we certainly can have Chief Womack come up here and address this more thoroughly, but I think what we're seeing here is the difficulty in filling positions and going through our HR process, recruiting and selecting individuals to fill those roles, and maintaining a competitive position in the market is where we're really challenged right now. So our objective is to have those 22 positions filled. There's nothing that we would like more than to have all of those positions filled so that we're providing the services that we budgeted for, and then we move forward from there knowing that we're still not at a level of service where we'd like to be. And obviously, as we get more into the budget process here, we'll have an opportunity to share more details about that.
And it's a little bit of a vicious cycle. You know, as you have vacancies, that work falls on less and less employees, so they're more likely to leave to go somewhere else where the work isn't. So if we can add resources, a lot of time that maintains employees longer. Okay, let's see. So we talked about the net expenditures. When you subtract the net expenditures from the revenues, you get the fiscal year impact, or the change in fund balance. So that's the increase or decrease in this case. So that's if you're spending or adding to that cash on hand, that checking account. As you can see, the imbalance increases over the 5 years to 14.7 million. Use of fund balance on an annual basis. That's in year 5 of the forecast period. And just for full disclosure, the negative fund balance is just for illustrative purposes. We can't adopt an imbalanced budget. It wouldn't work. And in fact, with fiscal year 2026 as depicted, we couldn't adapt the budget that year either. Just with the low ending fund balance, we couldn't make sure that we have contingency in all the departmental budgets at the level that we need. And that leads to that ending fund balance that rolls forward. And then down here in red, it's a little hard to see on the screen, but that's the change to fund balance also. This is actually the same information as the previous display in the graphical. The fund balance amount is shown on the right axis and the green line, and you can see that downward trend. This graphic might be familiar for you. We've used it for actually many years. The City Council and Budget Committee have a history of strong fiscal management that use both reductions in expenses and increases in revenues to balance the budget. This graph illustrates recent revenue and expenditure history in the general fund and the results of the 5-year forecast. It notes the impact of several significant actions over the past 10 years, including the closure of fire stations, elimination of approximately 90 positions in the fund about 10 years ago, and 4 years of legislative PERS rate relief. Also, during the period of PERS rate relief, the city also gained revenue from a real market valuation reset after the Great Recession as property came back. You also see the reopening of the 2 fire stations in fiscal year 2017 and 19, as well as the start of the homeless rental assistance program. And then beginning in fiscal year 2020, we see the positive impact of the city operations fee that narrowed the gap between revenues and expenses. After that, the CARES Act and ARPA funding show as a short-term infusion of funds in fiscal years 2020, 2021, and 22. And then as you can see, the revenues and expenditure lines are growing further apart as expenditures continue to outpace revenues. So same information as the table, the 2 lines are going in different directions.
Member Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Josh, can you remind us what the operations fee is currently? I know it was indexed, so it's not the original rate. Can you just remind the group where that's at?
So the rate just changed January 1st to $8.93. You won't see it on your bills until February because your January activities billed in February. So the city will actually see that revenue in the following month in March.
So originally, if I recall correctly, we set the fee at $8 and indexed it to inflation. So over the course of the past, what is it, 4 years, 3 years, it's gone up 93 cents.
Correct.
Thank you.
And we're anticipating, we don't have the final data from the CPI yet, but included in the forecast is a 7% increase going into next year, next January. And an excellent segue, one of the most notable positive impacts to the 5-year forecast is the city operations fee. This body, the Budget Committee, recommended the City Council look at new revenues, and the City Council formed the Sustainable Services Revenue Task Force in 2018. This group recommended 2 general fund revenue measures back to the City Council. The city operations fee was first on the list. On this slide in green, I have separated the city operations fee from the other general fund revenues. So you can see in fiscal year 2024, with that rate increase, we're anticipating $8.5 million. To demonstrate the significant positive impact of the city operations fee on our financials in the previous slide, this chart removes it from this display of the forecast. So you'll notice that the green line disappeared and the fund balance went down because we have a couple years of history that's not shown on this slide. So it's a much different financial picture without the city operations fee included. Any questions here?
I guess I have a question or more of a comment. So, I mean, to be really clear, at least for myself in understanding this, I'm probably just asking for a paraphrase, but when comparing, with the city operations fee and without, I remember Councilor Anderson, when he served on this body, kind of had the metaphor with Thelma and Louise driving near the cliff. And it looks like without this, we get to the cliff in 2024, whereas with the fees, we're okay up until maybe 2026.
That's accurate, yes. I would say we're okay through 2025.
Okay. So without it, it's sooner.
Without it, we couldn't adopt this next coming budget without some major changes. And just to remind everyone, that CARES Act funding and the ARPA funding, that would have made that happen several years sooner. We would have been having this conversation 3 years ago.
Thank you.
So Josh, even with us ending, without the operations fee, with us ending at 10.89, that's not enough to move forward, right? So we would have to be making cuts. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct. The 2024 budget, if you look at the negative ending fund balance, we could not adopt that budget legally.
And CFO, my question was the ARPA funds. We've exhausted all those?
Excellent question. So we have a very small portion. I think it's between a couple $100,000 and $400,000 left that are unallocated, but the majority has been spent. If you remember, $17.7 million was used for revenue placement across multiple funds, and then $8.1 million was used for unsheltered programs.
Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting that. Anybody else? Oh, Member Dixon.
Thank you, Chair. And Josh, thank you. I also wanted to thank both you and Kelly for getting me on board and for a very informative orientation presentation after I was approved for the committee by the council on Monday night. I really appreciate that help. I had one question about the general fund. I think it sort of fits in the direction we're going right now in the discussion. Is there a forecast risk for this fund? I saw that in the document for other funds, but I haven't found it for the general fund.
Yeah, good question. So I think you're referring to all the single forecast pages. They have a box that lists the risks specific for that fund. Most of the risks that are mentioned for all the other funds apply to the general fund also. We have a risk section. I don't know the page number, but we can get it for you. But just like all the other funds, personnel costs are a major contributor. As we're talking, it makes up 80% of the general fund budget is those personnel pieces. So, market wages, PERS, health benefits, those all are risks when we're talking about the general funds.
Thank you. And having the medium or high risk label on the other ones was easy for me. Where would you peg the risk for the general fund?
So it would depend on the item, but So in the budget office, we have funds that are on the watch list, right? The general fund is on the watch list. Transportation services is on the watch list. So they're a high risk for issues in the near term.
Thank you.
This graph you've seen displayed for 2 previous funds reveals possible scenarios for the general fund. The probable scenario in blue is just that, the likely outcome over the next 5 years based on all the assumptions, analyses, evaluation, and calculations in the forecast. The City Council fund balance policy is in the gray line, and as you can see in all 3 scenarios, the fund balance falls below the policy by fiscal year 2026. As I mentioned in the introduction, here's a display of the general fund with the recently adopted commercial air service included. I should note that I assumed 1.5 million of the infrastructure improvements would be eventually funded by the Urban Renewal Agency. So if you were watching Monday night, the council approved $1.9 million. I'm assuming that 1.5 of that is reimbursed from the URA. And the impact to the general fund, while significant, it doesn't materially change the outlook. A couple more views that I want to display.
Josh, I'm sorry
Go ahead.
So on this one here with the air service that we recently approved, is 2025 like okay, or is that amount not okay?
You would just scrape by with a budget adoption.
Okay.
The challenge, going back to just the commercial air service, you'd be fine in 2025. You'd still have a cash flow problem. Making payroll as we approach the property tax receipts, but as far as budget adoption, it wouldn't be a problem.
Maybe fine with an asterisk.
A big asterisk, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Member Shrock and then Nordike.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this gets at what I started to ask earlier. Basically, I was going to ask if we would be getting an updated sheet to the 5-year forecast that reflects that budget, current fiscal year budget adjustment, basically, that council made for commercial air service. That's just one example. There could, I suppose, be other budget adjustments in the current fiscal year, which of course affect the ending fund balance, and then that gets rolled forward, to the other years in the 5-year forecast. So yeah, could we get a copy of this and on the airport fund, something that shows the similar information, just so I can keep my forecast updated, for changes we know are happening in the current fiscal year. And then related to that, I believe there was expected to be but in addition to the 1.9, 6.5 million basically transferred from the general fund to the airport fund in the future years of the 5-year forecast. So one, am I understanding that right? And if so, could I get an updated sheet that shows the impact of that 6.5 million?
A really good question, and I'll make sure that you have this presentation with this updated slide. So this highlighted box in red includes those future subsidies to the airport fund to maintain that commercial air service, the operating costs. The capital construction is in fiscal year 2023. I'm anticipating 1.5 from the URA, 400,000 from the general fund, and then 466,000 for the operations in the current year. And then you can see, approximately 0.9 million going down to 0.72 million in the 5-year forecast. And again, there's a lot of assumptions with the commercial air service. It could look a lot different, but these are the best information we have right now.
Member Shrock, go ahead. Yes.
Just quick follow-up. Have you done something similar, and it may not be part of tonight's presentation, but for the airport fund, an updated sheet that shows, which are really pretty like doubling the airport fund's revenues because of the transfers?
Really good question. We don't have that updated today, but we can certainly layer that on the airport fund, and we can get it back to you at your next meeting, probably in the interim.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Member Nordike?
Thank you. I too had a question about the airport fund. Josh, you stated that your assumptions include funds coming from the URA, but what about potential federal funds towards capital improvements to the airport? Are those factored into the 5-year forecast?
Really good question. So any capital funds would actually go to the capital improvements fund in construction. So it's more of an in and out item for the airport fund. So it's not really a material issue there. It's on the infrastructure side.
Okay, so it's not going to be reflected in this slide on our screen because it's not about air service, it's about airport infrastructure. So that's why it's not on this reflected in this slide right now?
That is correct. This is only the anticipated need for a transfer from the general fund to the airport fund to maintain that subsidy.
Thank you.
At the risk of displaying more numbers, a couple more views that I want to display. This is the forecast with commercial air service, and if the general fund was required to fund the current homeless programs, they are being funded using one-time resources. So I think this is an important display because it includes continuation of navigation center, the 3 sheltering sites, the SOS team. So you can see that here in this unsheltered program line. A lower amount for fiscal year 2025 because we do have some remaining funding for the navigation center there, and then increasing by the end of the forecast period to 10.2. And just to be crystal clear, it's only the current programs. It's not adding any more shelter sites or any more staff.
So Josh, could you just speak to how we're paying for those now, right? Because we do have those costs right now. We don't see them on this piece of paper because they are being paid for. Could you please elaborate?
Yes, excellent question. So right now, that funding is coming into a trust fund for federal and state funding. Then it's going out as grants to Church at the Park. We have a separate fund for the navigation center operations, so they're contained outside of the general fund.
Thank you. Crystal clear, right, everybody? I don't see any hands up, so I think we're ready to tackle the next thing.
At the risk of one more additional display, I would be remiss if I didn't present a display that included the impact of the general fund with the continuation of unsheltered programs and addressing the deferred staffing need in the general fund. The deferred staff needs were presented to the Budget Committee during last fiscal year, and we did some pre-meetings also that you might remember. That report is included as an information item for you this evening. The need includes both community-facing programs as well as the internal support services. On the internal support service side, the city engaged Moss Adams, who's here tonight, organizational consulting firm, to complete a benchmarking analysis for internal services to see how we compare with other cities. They'll be briefly touching on that next. I should also note that even if we had the revenue to fund the staffing needs as displayed here in the general fund, they would need to be phased in over time. This is really for just illustrative purposes. We couldn't support 49.4 additional millions of staff today. We have recruiting issues, so it'd have to be a multi-year phase-in. The baseline forecast on the previous slides demonstrate a significant need to correct the structural imbalance in the general fund, but it doesn't show an accurate picture of the need in the community or the staff experience on a daily basis. Over the next several months and through fiscal year 2024 budget, staff will be working with the Finance Committee, the Budget Committee, and the City Council on options to address the structural imbalance, as well as other needs in the city.
Josh, we have a question from Member Dixon here.
Thank you, Chair. Josh, again, thank you for the information. Is there a schedule for analyzing the alternative ways to deliver services and opportunities for additional revenues that would fit into this budget cycle? Is that work going on at the staff level now to come up with recommendations for correcting the structural imbalance?
Excellent question. We anticipate those options going to the Finance Committee this month, the Council subcommittee that kind of tackles that type of thing. From there, we anticipate it going to the Council, perhaps at a work session, to have a robust discussion on what those options look like, as well as some fundamental questions about what the target is, what are we trying to solve for, things like that. But what I can do is I can send all of you a link to the 2018 Revenue Task Force materials that really included a broad range of revenue options that the city considered at that time.
Thank you. And one more question. You will also provide, for those of us who are keeping score at home, you'll also provide the slides that you've shown with the adjusted forecasts.
Yes, absolutely. I'm hoping someone can send them to you while we're talking, so we'll see if that happens.
Thank you so much.
Member Tigan.
Thank you. I think to build on Member Dixon's question. So I feel like I remember as the members of the Budget Committee, we considered and made a recommendation to the council to have the task force look at different revenue sources, which in the end ended up adopting the operations fee, which we can see has had a great impact. How long did it take from the moment, the May that we said, let's do this, to the point where money started showing up in the city's coffers?
Really good question. It was actually pretty quick for the operations fee. It was council adopted, and the Public Works did a great job getting it on the utility bill and get that billing started. So it was fairly quick on the operations fee side. Most other revenues, they take time to implement. That was one exception because we already had a streetlight fee. We already had a model that worked.
Okay. I just asked that question with fiscal year 2025 in mind.
Member Hoy.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, just as a reminder, there was discussion earlier about a potential fuel tax. That's not something that the council can impose. That has to be referred to voters, and only voters can approve that in Oregon. So,
and wouldn't address the general fund.
And wouldn't address the general fund.
Member Phillips.
This is just a verification. So on this final numbers page that includes the staffing needs, is that broadly speaking, I think it was like 308 FTEs that was identified as we're being short that for general fund FTEs? This includes all of that, or what fraction of that?
Yeah, very good memory. I think it was 307 and a half. So yes, that's the full breadth of that staffing.
So close. All right, thank you.
Member Nishioka, did you have a question?
I did, but it's more kind of speculative. With the new governor establishing an emergency for homelessness, there might be funding that could come available. And I'm assuming that we can't project that at this point, but if that hurries along and we start to hear, we could then add that into the general fund if we were starting to get money from the state.
Yeah, really good question. So we continue to lobby for additional funding, and if we receive it, we're happy to take it. It won't go into the general fund. It'll go into that trust fund for those services.
Mayor Hoy.
Thanks. And just to kind of address that directly, there's almost no chance that would happen before June 24th. So just it's not something we would be considering with this budget year, because there's almost no chance that any action would happen before that date.
So, Josh, question about that. And I know, I think it was about a month ago or a couple of weeks ago now, you might be able to speak to this too, Mayor. When the Biden administration really set some really great targets for reducing homelessness and addressing this crisis across the country, if money were to come from the federal government, would it too go into this fund that we have set up for the state funding?
Of course, it'd be council's discretion. It's likely restricted to a specific use, but yes, that mean my recommendation is to go into the trust fund and be granted out, or in the case of like the SOS team, it could be transferred to the general fund to continue to support that service.
That was a question I had. Some of this overlaps, right? So our response to our unsheltered crisis, we have folks in our community doing great work, like Church at the Park and others. But then we have our SOS team, right? So that's going to be coming out of the general fund, that portion. But the stuff that we're sending out to the community members that are our partners, that's coming from this trust fund. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Josh, did you have another slide? I think you have one more slide.
Yes, thank you. Next steps. In conclusion, the next steps for the city budget and the budget committee are listed on this slide. The council policy work session that helps inform the leadership team, City Manager Staley, as we develop and propose the next budget is happening next week. And then the staff, we really shift into budget development. And then the budget committee receives the city manager's proposed budget on April 19th. And then you have 3 additional meetings and 1 alternate meeting. And then we move into a public hearing and adoption in June.
Great, thank you so much. Any last questions for Josh? I know he'll be here all night, folks, so we can ask him all kinds of questions whenever we need to. But wanted to offer up that, so I'm just doing a quick scan here. All right, thank you, Josh, so much for the presentation. I know you will be close at hand. So now we are going to jump to agenda item 7B, and this is going to be a presentation by Moss Adams. Moss Adams has been working with the city on a variety of organizational projects, including our recent review of the city's forecasting process and the comparisons to other cities. So I'm going to hand this over to Colleen now. Thank you so much for being here. It's always wonderful to have you in the room, so thank you.
Great, thank you. Hello, Budget Committee. I am Colleen Rosillas. I'm a partner with Moss Adams. I lead local government consulting for the firm. Very happy to be here tonight. So I am joined by Tommy Conkling. He was a lead analyst on this project, and Tommy's going to share his screen and our presentation, so just give us a second. All right, so we were engaged by the city to support the ongoing work in this discussion that you all have been having tonight around your budget, your forecast, revenue options. And so there were a number of things that we did as a part of this project, and we're about 2/3 of the way through. The first was the deferred needs analysis and staffing analysis that Josh mentioned. We conducted a validation of that by doing benchmarking of internal services across the city. We'll run through a high-level results of that. We presented that to the Finance Committee back in November, and that has been provided to all of you. We also validated the city's forecast methodology. Is it aligned with best practice? Are there opportunities to improve how we do forecasting? What is the accuracy, and kind of stress tested the forecast so that we could validate that the numbers that you all saw tonight are accurate, are reasonable, are really the picture, so that you can make better decisions. Next step is for us to work in collaboration with city staff on those revenue options that you all just started talking about, providing analysis of what the committee had done previously, as well as taking a look at what might be happening in other local governments across Oregon, across the country, to see what other potential options there could be. So Tommy, if you could go to the next slide, please. So tonight we're going to review the results of that internal service benchmarking at a very high level. We'll dig into our results in terms of validating the forecast, and then we'll just talk about the implications of your current situation from that independent third-party perspective. Our timeline, we started this project in July. We've been working really closely with a group of city staff on that internal service benchmarking to make sure that it really reflected full service cities and the current state of Salem. We've been working on forecasting, and then we'll jump into scenario analysis and get that completed over the next couple of months. So Tommy, over to you.
Hi, my name is Tommy Conkling, and I'll be discussing internal services benchmarking and general fund forecast validation. So first, we're going to briefly go through the internal services benchmarking analysis that we presented to the Finance Committee in November, because it informs the findings of our forecast validation work. For those not on the Finance Committee, there's also more detail on this analysis in the packet that was provided to you if you want to examine this in further depth. We examined the level of internal services at the city, which include IT, HR, finance, and other functions, and we benchmarked these internal services to other full service peers. The first step in this process was identifying appropriate peer service cities. We identified 8 similarly sized full service cities in the Western continental United States with similar community characteristics. We prioritized using full service cities that provide almost all the same services as Salem. We then collected data on internal services at these 8 peer cities, examining 3 things: internal services staffing levels, the amount of operational expenses for these internal services, and their total capacity, which is a metric that combines the total amount of staffing with the level of outsourcing, giving us an estimate of the total manpower that a function has available. There were 3 headline findings from this analysis. First, almost all internal service functions in Salem are understaffed compared to peers. Internal service functions that are understaffed have an average of 75% less staffing than peer cities. Second, almost all internal service functions in Salem are underfunded compared to peers. For the internal service functions that we were able to obtain funding data for, on average, Salem functions have 87% less funding than peer cities. Finally, when examining staffing and outsourcing, most internal service functions in Salem have much less capacity than peer cities. When combining the staffing that these functions have with an estimate of the equivalent employees that outsourcing replaces, Salem internal service functions have 78% less capacity or manpower compared to peer cities. Summing this up, internal services at the city are under-resourced compared to peers, reaffirming the findings from the city's deferred needs analysis that shows that internal service functions are stretched thin. This creates operational risks for the city as the external services provided to Salem citizens rely on solid internal service functions. We will return to this benchmarking information later.
Hey, Tommy.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think we have a question in the room.
Yeah, we have a question here. Mayor Hoy.
Thank you. Can you identify which 8 cities you determined were comparable?
Yes. The 8 cities were Tempe, Arizona, Eugene, Oregon, Oceanside, California, Spokane, Washington, Corona, California, Salt Lake City, Utah, Glendale, California, and Modesto, California.
Thank you. Any follow-ups on that?
I only ended up with 5.
Oh, I will. I have them here. I'll show them to you.
They're also on page 60 of your agenda packet.
And the methodology of how we selected is also included there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions before I continue on?
I don't see any. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. So as I was saying, we will return to the benchmarking information later on, but we now turn to the main part of our presentation today, which is our general fund forecast validation for the city. The purpose of this work is to provide an independent analysis of the city's budget forecast, evaluating its accuracy and thoroughness. If our analysis were to validate the forecast, it would affirm the projections made by city staff that show a concerning financial situation that needs to be addressed in the coming years. Our forecast methodology had 3 parts. First, a review of the forecast for errors and mistakes. Second, an analysis of the forecast to ensure that it aligns with best practices for local government budgeting and financial forecasting. And finally, an overall evaluation of the assumptions and methodology that undergird the forecast. These 3 methods are presented in a purposeful order. The first method begins with a very exacting testing process in which the forecast is evaluated on its technical rigor and which there are very well-defined criteria. Either a forecast has errors or it doesn't. As we move into the next 2 methods, the evaluation becomes more holistic and reliant upon professional expertise and judgment. As you'll see, each of these 3 methods is an important and different assessment of the quality of the forecast. So first, we assessed if the forecast was technically sound. We evaluated the forecast to make sure that it does not have calculation errors. Budget forecasting is an iterative process in which the estimates of revenue and expenditures in later years are built upon earlier years. Because of this, any calculation errors that may first create small discrepancies in early years can have large and distorting effects in later years. We wanted to make sure that there were no errors distorting Salem's long-term financial picture. We performed this assessment through 3 steps. First, during the entire time that we engaged with the forecast, there was an ongoing assessment to identify any calculation errors. At any time that we engaged with the forecast, we were looking for any mistakes in the spreadsheets. Second, we performed an active assessment of a random sample of forecast rows. We first took 1,690 rows where the main part of the forecast calculations occurred. We then selected a sample of 5% of these, which is 85 rows. We then went through each of these rows to make sure that there were no errors. If we found any errors, we also planned to then assess an additional 5% of forecast rows. This testing process validated Salem's forecast. We found 0 calculation errors in the 5% sample of forecast rows. We also found no errors at any time while reviewing the forecast. Simply put, the forecast calculations are technically sound. Our next validation process was to examine Salem's alignment with industry standards for local government forecasting. The Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA, is the preeminent organization in North America for government finance professionals. They maintain a comprehensive set of industry standards for government financial management, including standards for budgeting and financial forecasting. For this next validation process, we identified all relevant GFOA best practices related to budgeting and forecasting. We then assessed the forecast document itself, along with our knowledge of the processes that city staff utilize to create the forecast, to evaluate whether Salem's forecast aligns with GFOA industry best practices. The GFOA has 4 main best practices that deal with budgeting and forecasting. First, there's a best practice on effective budgeting of salary and wages. This standard deals with accurately estimating budgeted positions, utilizing vacancy adjustments, projecting personnel costs associated with collective bargaining units, and assessing optimal staffing levels. In each of these elements, Salem's practices fully align with this industry standard. One important thing to note here is that the city's deferred needs analysis, along with our internal services benchmarking analysis previously presented, align with industry standards for determining optimal staffing levels. Second, the GFOA has a best practice on financial forecasting in the budget preparation process. This standard deals with the processes of forecasting, defining assumptions, gathering information, selecting forecasting methods, and linking the forecast to decision-making. Once again, Salem's practices fully align with this standard. Importantly, linking the forecast to decision-making is what we're doing right now. Third, the GFOA has a best practice on inflation indices in budgeting. As one might expect, this standard deals with how best to forecast inflation, which is especially important at a time in which the cost of living has increased more rapidly than any time in the past 4 decades. Salem's practices align with this standard. Finally, the GFOA has a best practice on long-term financial planning, which outlines the necessary processes for effective forecasting of long-term revenues, expenditures, along with determining the impact of these forecasts. Salem's practices, once again, align with this standard. This second process further validated the city's forecast. In each case, Salem's financial forecast fully aligns with GFOA best practices. Finally, we performed an evaluation of the forecast's assumptions and methods for projecting city revenue and expenses. This final assessment is important because even if a forecast aligns with best practices, and even if it's free from error, projections can still be performed in suboptimal ways. Different assumptions could be used, or different methods of projecting expenditures or revenues could be used to better forecast city finances. For this last validation process, we reviewed expenditure and revenue forecasts, looking for any instances in which we would, in our professional judgment, change the assumptions or methods to better forecast city finances. Simply put, we looked to see if we would do anything differently in the forecast. This process yielded the same result, validating the city's forecast. For every revenue and expenditure, we found almost nothing that we would do differently to forecast city finances. We had one sole finding around general inflation factors used for fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2026, in which Federal Reserve inflation projections released in December might cause the city to consider upping its general inflation figures slightly for these 2 fiscal years. It's important to note, however, that this finding is minuscule. Implemented or not, this change would not significantly impact the forecast. but it is the one instance where we found anything that we would change. We found the city's financial forecast has no calculation errors, it aligns with industry standards, and its assumptions and methods are sound. I would be remiss if I didn't emphasize the rigorous and complex processes involved in creating such a strong budget forecast. Although the result of the forecast can be simply summed up in a few tables, the machinery that staff create to produce these results is immense. It involves thousands of points of data integrated into a carefully organized matrix that synthesizes the city's financial history, operational and staffing practices, national and regional economic trends, and other important factors. It takes this immense amount of data and it distills it into a few headline numbers that can allow decision makers like yourselves to effectively steward city dollars. In summary, in our professional opinion, Salem's forecast is valid and is of the highest quality. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Colleen.
Great, thanks, Tommy. We probably could have led with that and shortened it, but we really wanted to give you all of the detail and really show the rigor that goes into this work so that you know when you're going forward over the next several months, potentially several years, looking at these options that you really do have very strong data at your fingertips. So Tommy, if you could go to the next slide, please. So
I believe Member Schrock has a question.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. Member Schrock.
Thank you, Chair. On the GFOA best practices, that last one mentioned long-term financial forecast, something like that, which Salem aligned. How does GFOA define long-term? You know, Salem uses a 5-year forecast, and we also use 5 years for our capital improvement plan. What does GFOA consider long-term?
So that's a great question. GFOA defines it precisely at that, 5 years.
Great, thank you.
It's possible to do a 10-year or longer forecast. We have some clients that have a long-range forecast that goes out 20 plus years. Things become extraordinarily variable once you get over that 5-year mark. It does potentially allow you to see the implications of some of your decisions, you know, past our time maybe, but it definitely is a lot more speculative once you get past 5 years. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So we work primarily with local governments, and we work with dozens of cities every year. And one of the pieces of information, some of the value that we add by doing this is just, you know, what's happening in other communities, and in our experience, what is your situation? So Tommy, would you go to the next slide, please? So I think we've already had this conversation tonight, but from your sort of independent third-party position, your expenditures are exceeding your revenues, you're running a deficit budget. Like many other cities, you had the immense luxury of federal and state funding from the pandemic to be able to close some of those operational gaps, but that essentially just pushes out some of these hard decisions, and they are coming near, and soon the city won't be able to adopt the budget. And when we think about the current budget, if you could go to the next slide, couple of things that we really want to underscore. So we know that our internal services, the engine that makes government run, are understaffed, somewhere between 25 and 50 FTE, depending on the service level that we do want to provide to the community. In addition to that, internal services are in general just underfunded, and all city services are underfunded by at least $49 million. That's not including really thinking about the growth of the community, the service levels that the community does expect. And so we really want to underscore that the city has some pretty big decisions on your plate, and one single revenue option is probably not going to cover all of these challenges, but we'll be working on that over the next couple of months. So with that, if you have other questions, we're ready to take them.
I would also like to just start by saying, if the public is watching and wanting to dive into this, I would get a hold of our packet from tonight, because it does give the presentation that you all gave us at the Finance Committee, and that really gets into the details about what kind of staffing are we talking about, where is the staffing needs, and what does the dollar amount look at, or look like. Even the comparison from the 8 different cities to us, what do their staffing levels look like? What does their revenue look like? So it really is a great piece of work that we can look at and work from. City Manager?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to point out something in regards to the internal services funds and the underfunding of them and the impact it has on direct services. You don't, that connection isn't obvious, but one of the challenges that we're having in filling the police department vacancies is just running the human resource process fast enough to keep up with the attrition that we're experiencing in the police department. So as we think about this, fully funding the police department, for example, it's not just officers that are necessary to maintain that fully subscribed status. It's also the HR personnel and the finance personnel and others in our internal services that support those functions that allow that to happen. So oftentimes we think of those as separate. Let's add some additional police officers without thinking about the implications to human resources and finance and the rest of the operation. So not to take anything away from the police department, but thinking about it, holistically. Thank you.
Thank you for pointing that out. And Member Dixon, I see you, but I have one question here for the city manager and maybe for our HR staff in the room. Just for us to fully understand that, what is the ratio for internal staff versus more of our, external staff? Is it kind of an 8-to-1 or 6-to-1?
Colleen has studied that issue in way more detail than I have.
Great.
Yeah, so best practice for HR departments is about 100-to-1. Depending on the level of work that the HR department is doing, it might actually be a little bit less in local government. It really depends based on the internal service, and there are some industry benchmarks, but that was some of the work that we dug into as part of that Finance Committee presentation. Tommy, do you have anything off the top of your head related to the other services?
No, not at this time.
But we can get that for you.
Yes, and the other services that you're referring to would be things like legal or finance, like those types of services, internal, that folks don't necessarily see, but are really critical to the functioning of the city.
Yeah, so legal, payroll, procurement, all the other operations of finance, IT, and kind of up and down IT, both sort of that operational and help desk piece. There's also facilities and fleet. What did I miss, Josh? That's good? Okay, I checked them all.
Thank you. I think that gives folks a really good idea of what we're talking about. So Member Dixon, do you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Colleen and Tommy. That was very interesting information. I'm not sure who to direct this question to, but having the comparative information about staffing levels, I think, is very helpful. I wonder if any work is being done to look at comparing sources of revenue to see how Salem compares to that, and also to look at organizational and staffing comparisons with comparable cities. Is that work being done? Is that work anticipated?
So I can start. So we weren't asked to look at all of the city services as part of this, in part because service levels that are provided to the community, you get a really great check on that because you do your statistically significant resident survey every year. And so we get information from the community around what do we want, how are we performing, and that's probably your best way of saying how well staffed are we for what our community needs. We absolutely can dig into that if that's something that city really wants us to, compared to other cities. When we look at revenue sources, so absolutely we want to look at what's happening with other cities in Oregon, what are you allowed to do under state law, as well as there are opportunities in terms of different sort of funding mechanisms, so that's something we're digging into with staff. It's a little bit more challenging to use all of our benchmark cities in that case because obviously other states have other tax situations. It's really hard to compare Washington and Oregon, even though you really want to for example. Josh, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just real quick. So part of that deferred needs staffing analysis included some studies that the police department, the fire department have had done by their own expert consultants. So those pieces are built into those numbers when we look at that deferred staffing analysis. For example, the police department, between 25 and 83 officers down. For the fire department to meet the council standard, we need 5 additional stations. So we have that information for those kind of services. And in addition, we've done internally for services like parks operations and code enforcement.
Is there any more questions? Yes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So my question, and this is probably to CFO. So last May when we had this conversation, and Moss Adams is here, there were no surprises, right? I think Tommy said everything is aligned, so nothing caught us off by surprise.
Sorry. Yeah, that is correct. No surprises. This year's forecast incorporates more information than we had with last year's forecast. If you pull up the two, this year's is worse. We've had some expenses that were higher than anticipated, but that's what happens with forecasting. You get better information, your forecast gets more accurate.
And so I know Tommy mentioned and he showed some figures in regards to everything's, understaffed, and we knew this going into it. But did Moss Adams have any suggestions, or did I miss that slide? And I'm being serious, because we knew going into this that we had some issues, and I think CFO and his team did a very great job last year telling us what we know now. So what were the big take-home moments that we need to work on?
Yeah, well, if you stay in your current position, you're at pretty significant risk. Number one, in terms of just attrition of staff, right? You are staffed at low levels compared to your peers, particularly for the service that the community is asking for. That burns people out. The Great Resignation is real. We have a significant risk then of losing institutional knowledge, not really doing adequate succession planning for those roles, and that could be a really significant loss of efficiency and service to the community. There's also some compliance risks. So when we think about your HR department, legal, procurement, being able to keep up with the volume of work with a low level of staff, things are much more likely to slip through the cracks. So it's very important to think about what can we do to automate, what can we do to invest in technology, how can we get our policies and procedures as tight as possible to prevent that, but there's always going to be that risk, and that absolutely is increasing. I think there's also a piece of your strategic initiatives, that big picture stuff, the stuff that you want to do, like the airport, like responding to homelessness. Without the capacity to do that, you really are not going to be able to achieve those goals. And so thinking about from the top down, what the city manager said to start out this meeting, the city has operated in a more with less environment for many, many years. And there's no more capacity to do more with less. And so now we've got to make some tough decisions.
And a part of your methodology, and I think Tommy may have addressed this, we understand the math, but how much time did you actually spend talking with community members, or was that a part of your methodology?
Not for this project, no, but we've worked with the city. We updated your strategic plan a couple years ago, and we've worked with you on a number of other projects. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of the community. Again, I would say that using your statistically significant survey, and then with respect to functions like public works and like public safety, where you can look at work orders and calls for service, those are a great way to just see what is the baseline need and what is the community asking us for.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Member Tigan?
Yeah, I have a question for the folks at Moss Adams. Thank you for the presentation. My question is whether Salem is unique. You have experience talking to a lot of different cities in Oregon and across the West, it sounds like. Is Salem unique in its conundrum? I mean, the words, structural deficit have been used to describe our budget since I joined the budget committee 6 years ago. Is that common across Oregon, that cities are facing this and working around it? Is it, I guess that's my question. Is it a common situation for cities.
Yeah, it is a common situation, particularly for mid-sized and smaller cities. The Oregon local tax code was set into place in the 1970s. Essentially, our operations have changed, what we need has changed, and most importantly, fixed costs are increasing at a much higher rate than our revenues are, and that's true for just about every local government in America. I think the thing that makes you unique is the urgency of your situation, that your 5-year forecast says we will be in the red. A lot of cities that we work with, it might be their 10-year forecast or their 15-year forecast. And so it's either punting or it's maybe making some smaller strategic moves.
Thanks.
Member Nordyke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to follow up or piggyback on what Member Teagan had to say, because I do find it helpful to understand whether our experience as a city with structural deficits is similar to what's happening to other cities, particularly in Oregon, because every city, if they know what they're doing, they're going to be asking their legislators and their governor to help. They're going to be asking for the same pools, pots of money. They're going to be looking for the same grants from the federal government, from the state government, and so on. And I'm really curious to see how this session takes shape, because yes, there's a lot of things we won't know if or when we would benefit from what might happen in the legislature. But I am encouraged to hear that our new governor has already issued an executive order declaring a state of emergency and for certain parts of the state, and that includes Marion and Polk County. Does that mean we'll be getting some dollars to help us with our state of emergency and homelessness? Too soon to tell. And it's too soon for us to fold that into our budgetary forecast. And I also know that our mayors across the state, including our very own mayor, are calling on our governor to ask for a lot of money to help with the crisis that we have all inherited, that every city council is now looking at. I know city councilors in other parts of the state, many of them are seeing the same problems we are: homelessness, lack of affordable housing. These things are top of mind in rural parts of the state, urban parts of the state, the coast, Portland, Medford, on and on it goes. So I'm always curious to hear what other cities are doing. And I'm also curious to see what will the legislature do, because they have a lot more resources, but I think it really behooves all of us to urge our elected officials at every level of government to advocate for ourselves, advocate for our piece of the pie. So those are really more of my thoughts, but I'm just appreciative of the conversation. And I really appreciate the robust amount of dialogue we're getting from our civilian members, because I truly believe that a budget committee needs to be not just counselors like me speaking up. I want to hear from all of our public members. So I just really just want to say how much I appreciate this conversation and respectful dialogue, and look forward to hearing more.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? I know I have a thought that's churning in my mind, so I'm going to ask my question, and I think it's to you. I've had conversations with our deputy city manager, Krishna Nambari, about this idea of who we hire versus the behind-the-scenes folks, and wondering if there's some kind of policy that the city council has that one cannot be linked without the other. And I know she was saying that we don't have that policy right now. And the reason why I bring this up here is because, you know, this last year when we asked that we hire 6 new officers, you know, we didn't have this conversation then. And I'm sure if we did, we would have maybe made some other arrangements. But I'm wondering if this committee would be a good place for that conversation to start and possibly be a recommendation to council.
Absolutely.
If others think that that's a good idea. But yeah, something I have been thinking about I think it would be a really good thing to think about and maybe have a good conversation. Josh, maybe you can help work that into one of our meetings here coming up.
Absolutely.
Seeing no other questions, I want to thank Moss Adams for their time and energy and all of your skill. I appreciate every time you're in front of us. It's always educational, so thank you. And moving forward, it looks like we're going to be moving to agenda item 7C, and that's going to be a preview by our very own Josh Eggleston and the city's new budgeting and performance management tools. I'm very excited about this, Josh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And a quick caveat, we're just going to do a preview today, but the way they're set up is you can do as much exploring as you want on your own. Sorry, just getting things. Okay, so we'll start first with the performance management module. So as you can see here, transparent reporting and analytics for residents. So this has been a long effort, a brainchild of many different staff members, and it really is a cross-departmental effort to get information in here. I will say it's an iterative process. So it's in its current form, and I expect the next form to be even better. So as we move forward. So starting here on the left, annual scorecard. The way this set up is kind of a report card format for the prior year. So it's interactive. You can select the fiscal year here on the left, and you can see the score for each of the results areas. If you remember, that's how we organize the city budget, by program and then results area. For example, if you click on Safe and Healthy Community, what it does is it dives into the actual individual measures. You can't see it here, but when you log in yourself, you'll be able to see those individual measures. It groups them by a program group, and you can see the individual measures and how we're doing for that particular year. So in this case, in July, August of each year, we'll finalize the annual scorecard for the previous year. It's not just like the annual satisfaction survey, that's a small piece of it, but there's operational measures in here as well. Some things we're not quite there yet. There needs to be some more measures added. One in particular, you might notice a 209% score for strong and diverse economy. It sounds really great, but it's based on 3 measures. One of them is dragging it upward. So we're actually going to expand this into the future, add some measures, and it should make it a more realistic number. In addition to that annual scorecard, if you want to look at the current year performance measures, some are updated monthly, some quarterly, some are updated annually. You can click on current performance, and some of those same scorecard measures plus some are contained here, also organized by result area. And you can see some of the description and why it's important, the desired trend, the targets. Some of the targets are council adopted, like our fire response time. Others, we don't have an adopted council measure, so it's staff generated for the target. In addition to the annual scorecard and the current performance, also the budget is included here. So it shows 4 different years of adopted budgets and the corresponding results area budgets, and there's also some other reports there, so you can actually see by program, by results area. You can see budget to actuals, so not just the quarterly reports you received this evening. The same information, if you pull up 2022, you can find online. You can peruse it at your leisure. And then also we have that fourth button is an introductory video. It kind of walks you through how it works. I'd recommend you watch that video and feel free to dive in. Any questions on this?
Just for staff, I'm noticing up on the screen that it looks like Councilor Nordyke's trying to get back in. Thanks.
Thank you.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
A while ago, you and I sat down and chatted about this, and there was yes, you're nodding your head. Okay. There was a portal where you could make adjustments.
Yes.
Is that part of this? And if so, could you tell me where, or tell everybody where we can go to see that?
Really good question. So that's part 2, if I can get the mouse to actually go. Okay, so this is, I believe, what you're referencing. This is a budget simulation tool that the city has made an investment in. So similar to something like SurveyMonkey, but it's interactive and you can actually make adjustments. So we have an introduction here. Basically, I've described it as you can play city manager, you can adjust the budget, you can solve our budget problems. We'd love for that to happen. We asked for some demographic information. We've had several submissions. It's been interesting to go through. To align to what we talked about earlier this evening, it's fiscal year 2024 is what we're looking at. So if you look at your documentation, you'll see a $9.5 million deficit. It's exactly the number that we're looking at here. And what this allows you to do is you can actually go to Safe and Healthy Community. You can see the 3 departments. It's not quite departments, it's not quite programs, it's kind of a different service area. But for example, the police department, you think we need more officers. What you can do is you can add dollars to the police department. You can also reduce dollars. I inputted some information. If you're trying to reduce the police department budget, I'm going to tell you that we actually need more officers, not less. Just a little reminder there. You can still make the change, not a problem, but just know that we need more. There's different reminders throughout the tool. We'll continue to modify it, just like a survey. This is version 1 based on the 2024 forecast. When we present the proposed budget, there will be another version based on that proposed budget. I'm hoping that's even more in depth with a little more interaction. For this committee, probably one of the more interesting areas is actually on the revenue side. So you can see our different revenue sources. Some of them you'll see a lock. For example, property taxes, we can't increase our permanent rate. Same for our local marijuana tax. If you click plus, it's going to tell you we can't because the state doesn't let us. We're already taxing the maximum. Fees and permits, some of these you can play with. The city operations fee, for example, you can add $3, $7, or $9 per month if you want to see what that does to the city budget. All you do is just click on it and you'll see it, the adjusted balancing of the city budget.
Josh, let me interrupt real quick because
Go
we
ahead.
have a question from member Dixon. I want to make sure it might be about this.
Thank you, Chair. Josh, it's actually about the performance indicators. If you want to come back to that, I'm happy waiting.
Okay, let me just finish up with this real quick, then we can jump back. The other good place to make adjustments here is I added a category for potential new revenue. This is where you'll find a local payroll tax and a local option levy. You guys probably know this. A local payroll tax can be implemented by a city council or it can go to voters. A local option levy has to go to voters, similar to a gas tax. But if you want to see what a payroll tax of 0.5% of wages in Salem does to the city budget, all you do is click and you can see that balance across the bar. And then the same for a local option levy. But as you can see, it's send a local option levy to voters. It's not just implement a local option levy. There'd be more work to do. On both the revenue and expenditure side, you can have your own suggestion. Feel free to plug in a different revenue source you think we could do. And we'll definitely review it and look at it. We'd love to find a new idea.
I really am excited about this tool. I think it's so much fun. Maybe it's just my personality. But I think it's so great in a way to, we're always talking with staff about communicating more with our community to try and to educate, but also gain input from them. And I think this is a great way to do that. I see a question from Councillor Nordyke. Is it about this one? I don't want to have Josh have to go back and forth because I know we're going to go over to another area for Member Dixon's question.
Oh, well, considering my internet service was briefly interrupted, I may or may not be on task. I just had a quick question. I saw levy was on this screen, and I just wanted, if Josh had not already defined levy, who pays for levies? What kind of individual? I have a theory as to who, but I think it might be helpful for the group to understand who would be on the hook for paying for a local levy.
A really good question. So the way it's depicted here is a local option levy. So it's a time-limited temporary levy that the city can adopt, or the residents can vote for and adopt. And what it is, it's an additional property tax on property owners within the city limits.
So no renters would have to pay for a local levy option because they don't own they don't own property, correct?
So they wouldn't pay for it directly. I would assume that it could be included in the rent when there's an adjustment.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go over to Member Dixon and tackle that question.
Thank you, Chair and Josh. Getting back to the reporting and analytics, where in there would we find indicators about helping people either stay in their homes or find more affordable housing, and providing services working with people who are currently unhoused?
Really good question. So you would want to go into either the annual scorecard or the current performance and look up welcoming community, welcoming and livable community. That's the results area where those would be. I will tell you it's a little light. I mean, data is a little bit hard to come by there. And some of that is not necessarily a city measure. It's more of a Salem Housing Authority measure. So there's a little bit of crossover there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Member Tigan.
My question was just about what the rollout for that budgeting tool looks like to the public. I mean, if it's something that has been sent out, or is that something the city plans to share leading up to the next budgeting cycle?
Good question. So I would consider what we've done now as a soft rollout. So it was included in the press release for this meeting. I can tell by how many people are visiting that it's not getting out there as much as we might hope. But definitely it's out there, it's live. If you look in your budget community email that I sent on Friday, it includes the link to both the performance measure and the balancing act simulation. We'll also be sharing it on social media. And then again, before your meeting in April, once we know exactly what the proposed budget is, we'll be revamping it with those numbers if there's modifications, and relaunching it prior to your meetings in April.
And I had a quick question. Is this website able to be translated into different languages?
Really good question. So the performance management, I don't believe is in any other language at this point. It is browser based. So if you have your browser set to a different language, it'll translate. It does pretty good. For Balancing Act, the step 2, it supports other languages, but we have to translate all the little snippets into other languages. So we're planning to launch it in Spanish as well.
Great. Good news. Thank you. Is there any other questions? I don't see any questions. So I want to thank you, of course, Josh, for all the information. Thank you to the team for pulling all of the packet together. I know I was very cozy with a cup of coffee as I read my packet. It was very thorough, and so thank you for all of that. Do we have anybody at this point in time for public comment? I'm seeing a no.
No.
Thank you so much. Before we adjourn, I do want to say that we have an opening on the Budget Committee, and it's our at-large member. So if there is anybody that you all know that you feel would be a great fit, or if anybody's listening, please put in an application, and we would love to have that filled before we kick off our meetings later this spring. So if there is nothing else, we are adjourned.